Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredible Valerie Keller.
So let me talk a little bit about my why and give you a little bit of a practical example on kind of two things. I'll talk about social innovation, and then I want to talk a little bit about the role of women and why it's important and why we're talking about that as part of social innovation. So I was working on poverty alleviation in the U.S., and if you're going to work on that in the U.S., the highest concentrations of that are in the South. And so I was based in the southern region when Hurricane Katrina hit. Right, you remember this? And it was terrible. It was a disaster of just epic proportions for the people that were there. Many people lost their lives. And it was an opportunity in a crisis moment. Right? It was an opportunity for, you're going to have all the status quo has been disrupted. People are thinking about things in a totally new way. And this is an opportunity for us to address housing and healthcare needs together in a holistic way. We created coalitions that would bring together what I call the suits and the sandals. They would bring together people, and we would talk about the business case for those from the business community. And we talked to those, the sandals, the Birkenstock, the advocates, and those in the church and faith community on why this was a moral imperative that we get together now to do things differently. And we created a program, a plan, a big, bold vision, right? Because it's important to have a big, bold vision and how you frame about ending homelessness and using what was happening post-Katrina to be a model on ending homelessness for our most vulnerable citizens. And we combined the government, we got government subsidies and incentives and tax breaks. We got it set aside to create housing that would stimulate the private market, and then have the nonprofit community, the foundation philanthropic community, be able to provide that layer of supportive services that was needed. What we found was the power of collaborating to catalyze and celebrate opportunities. After this, I went to Oxford University. I went to get a mid-career MBA. And when I got to Oxford, I found out there were 5 women in my class of 50. It blew me away. And then when I started to find out, and the reason why is because women weren't applying, this wasn't on their radar, it to me opened up an entire world of structural barriers and systemic biases against women. That began my journey into saying how. How do we look at addressing this issue? And let me talk a little bit about the how of social imperative, and the how we transform our world, this big sticky problems, calls for human capital. The big wicked problems that we have in the world, we can't afford to leave half our brains on the table. And of course, as you know, women make up more than 50% of the population of the world. And in a country and a region perspective, women's advancement is equivalent to economic growth. And from a company perspective, it becomes imperative for productivity and creativity. Now, on a quality level of needing what do we need in terms of our human capital, I think Desmond Tutu says it best. Isn't this a great picture of him? Desmond Tutu has been quoted as saying, the Archbishop saying, if he had one wish to change the world, he would have more women leaders. What we see in this greater context that we've been describing, and what you've actually seen modeled in the examples that have been talked about today, has been leadership that is global and diverse. It's flexible and it's flat. So I think another thing that's really interesting, we talked about this today, was about this kind of shift to the business case, the empirical data. It's one thing to talk about we need social justice for women, but we're talking about how we need a world that works for everybody. And in a world that works for everybody, there's data now that makes enough of a case, the case is starting to be built upon, that says it's common sense, that the dollars and cents are there. The other side of the business case is that it's awfully risky to not have diversity of thought and diversity of skills. And I think another way to think about diversity and about social sustainability and about acting in your environment is that if you're doing the right thing, if you're a publicly traded company, your risk goes down, your Sharpe ratio improves, your stock price can potentially improve as well. I mean, I think in order to think about risk management, we have to think about what is the risk of not being diverse. We are starting to see a gender premium. There is a question now, is there maybe not a causation, but is there a correlation between diversity and financial performance? And let's look together briefly at the problems, challenges, and solutions. How big is the gap? Well, if we look at the gender gap, it matters the context that we're in, the culture and the cultural context. And when we were in Jordan, we found that women 97% literacy, 15% employment. I think the developed world is not so developed in this regard. right? And we have some what I call structural issues. We need to get our house in order. We have glass ceilings and leaky pipes. So, and I have a friend of mine, Veritas Gowdy, who I'll talk about a bit later. And Veritas, when she talks about the leaky pipeline issue, where you can see that we're starting off, and this holds true also in the European context, right? Very similar. We start off really great. We've got women in the first layers. It starts to dribble down to around the 15th percentile in middle management. By the time that you get up to the top CEOs of multinationals, you're down to 3%. So Veritas Gowdy, I love how she puts it. She says, we don't have a pipeline problem. That's rubbish, she says in her British way. We have a pipeline. We have to figure out how to get to the pipeline. So what we have is an upgrade versus the intake problem. And what we're finding is that because people can't see female leadership role models, or because they're not seeing diversity in all of its forms, both ethnicity, sexual orientation, color, because they can't see it, we don't naturally associate these people with those types of leadership. So if we know we have these cognitive biases, there's a lot of work being done now on what are the things that we can do that kind of help us make the right decisions. We don't want to be biased, we want to do the right thing. And so how can we know that we have these biases and mitigate against them? This was an interesting study about blind orchestra studies. Have you all seen this before? Curtain put down for auditions versus a curtain up so that you can see the gender. Only difference, right? What they found was a 30% increase on the women being hired with the curtain down. So how do you put that into place in a corporation? Another way that we're looking at changing the system is inspecting what we expect. And maybe you've heard about the Gender Equality Project, which is an assessment tool that companies can put in place that tells them where they are on this framework of key metrics and key drivers that would close the gender gap. And they're also looking at establishing a certification, essentially doing the same thing for the green movement that doing the same thing that Lee Sander did for the green movement. So the idea, could you have a gender equality certification that helped to measure this? And this is where we get into talking about this connectivity between social innovation and these new models of leadership and new ways of being, and how that's actually playing out in this space to help solve the gender gap and create diversity and create growth. This collaboration, convening, catalyzing. I want to go through a few examples with you, because I think they're amazing models. We just had Helena Morrissey over into the New York to talk about what they're doing with the 30% Club. They've seen incredible results already since March. 48% of the new FTSE 100 directors, 30 out of 62 are women, right? They did some interesting things. They pulled together the investor community, right? Investors just start asking, hey, where are you in diversity? Companies respond. They pulled together, they got male champions, CEOs who do this. They created a very wide tent. So they've got the headhunter community, they've got consultants coaching, people that are skills building, women's associations and networks, and they're doing it by driving through the business case. And what I think this presents an opportunity for, specifically, given the leadership traits that we know are needed, given the way the world is working in terms of its openness, its flexibility, is that I think it calls for leadership, male and female, that is both soft and strong. That's a blend of grace and grit. And I do think that we have an opportunity to think differently and to be differently. To own our power in the world, not just power posing, but to own our power in the world, to be agents of catalytic change, to know that the world needs us. It needs women. It needs quality, effective leadership. Leadership that can collaborate, that can convene, that can catalyze. Leadership that is flexible and fluid. And that's the invitation, and that's the opportunity that we have in front of us today.
This was such a convincing speech of yours. And I see very often that it takes a combination of different elements to really convince people. Not only convince their heads, but also their hearts, so they can use their hands. What is your secret? What would you recommend everybody, women and men, as an inner attitude, so that we really can move something?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes to the core of what I was talking about in the final part of our conversation, that really it's about our own paradigm, right? Is that if you walk in confidently being the change you wish to see, right? Which I think is in the program materials, we saw that, right? That great Gandhi quote. If you know good for the world, then that creates a base that says, well, of course you're going to act on that, right? So I think it comes from inside. At an internal level, I think that women struggle often with confidence. So even if we know something, a lot of times we don't speak up. And I don't know what that is about us, but it's the world over, wherever I've been. Even in the more outspoken American and Dutch cultures, the women don't speak up as much. So I think that having that place of being powerful, understanding our power, owning it, having confidence in our capabilities and our abilities, understanding that the world needs what we have to bring to the table, and part of that is bringing the heart and the head. So it's equipping yourself, putting in your hands, like you said so beautifully, the cases, the empirical data, and standing on that. I also think it's important, and we talked a bit about this in framing something. I heard some conversation about that this morning, shifting the paradigm and how you frame it. I like talking about the business case. Helena Morrissey, the lady who has 9 kids, who started the 30% Club, you know what she says? She's a pure businesswoman, right? And she talks about the business case. And then she flips it. I love this. She says, no one can disprove the business case for gender equality. And I think it's the same thing also when talking about diversity, talking about it not as a women's issue, right, but as a necessity for the world issue. It's one thing to say these barriers exist, but if we go around seeing barriers, then we're going to react to those, right? I mean, Henry Ford said it best. He said, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right.
I'm in the steel industry, so I would really wish to see my CEO your presentation. But now it's me, I have to do this presentation for him, not you, I know. But the question is, I would like to give him a recommendation where to find maybe a platform where industry is exchanging best practices, is exchanging know-how on this. Because only with good examples I can give him an advice.
Because what we've seen also with the 30% Club in the UK was they created it. So there wasn't an existing place where they got men champions. So if you're in the UK, I would say, go get your boss, talk to Helena Morrissey. She will put him on her group. In the absence of that, you could look at saying, if there's nothing that's existing, can they plug into something, you create something. Because I do think there's opportunity and space for that. I often say, find what else is out there and then plug in. But I think that also comes into role modeling. And the reason why, you remember Victoria Budson said women don't realize how few women are in positions, they think it's more. If they're getting there because they see role models, and I think they don't see them enough in the STEM industries. So thank you for being a great example.
Very much.